All right. Let's go ahead and get started, see how it goes. I'd like to say a few things about the reading before I let you guys say a whole bunch of things about the reading. First of all, the title of the chapter, which, by the way, on Tuesday you'll be reading another chapter from this same book about Asians, for the most part, Japanese, Chinese, etc. The book itself is called The Legacy of Conquest. It's what we call a Western history, or a history of the West, a history of the Western United States. And this particular chapter is entitled The Persistence of Natives. And I want you to be thinking about that meaning as we talk about the reading. Because I think that, as I've told you before, when you read a chapter or you read a book, you should think about the title so that you can organize the information in the chapter or the book around the title, right? So when we're done with this reading, if the only thing that you hear is the title, The Persistence of Natives, you ought to be able to come up with a whole bunch of stuff from that reading, right? So the question really is, what does the author mean by the persistence of natives? We're not going to answer that right now, but that's something I want you to be thinking about, okay? I would also remind you that the reading talks about, it talks about federal policy, federal Indian policy. And I would simply remind you that in terms of a timeline, or in terms of a chronology of this federal Indian policy, and by federal, we mean the federal government of the United States of America. So, we mean the United States of America, okay? But in particular, we're talking about federal policy. Basically, what we're talking about are several phases. I suppose we're talking about the period before Indian removal, but not so much. But we are talking about the period of Indian removal in the 1830s, basically when Native Americans were moved forcibly across the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi. Okay? Indian removal. Then followed, some 50 years later by the Dawes Act in 1883, which basically moved Native Americans onto reservations, gave them citizenship, but also encouraged them to become essentially either farmers or ranchers, okay? With the idea that they would assimilate and become, Americans as a result of this reorganization. Again, a federal policy essentially imposed upon them. That would be followed in 1934 by the Indian Reorganization Act, which was part of the New Deal. And basically what happens there is that the Dawes Act is kind of overturned. Rather than trying to create a bunch of individual, successful farmers or ranchers who would be good Americans and good Democrats, and by Democrats I mean people who participate in the political system, I don't mean party members, what we go back to is an attempt to reestablish tribal reservations, tribal organizations of Native Americans. It's an attempt, then, to kind of accommodate the ancient culture, if you will, of Native Americans. And then this other period, which is more nebulous, is the period of the Cold War, where basically, I'm not sure how federal policy changed, except that there were a lot of attempts to kind of once again break down the communalism of Native American tribalism and, shall we say, help these people become good American individuals who, take care of themselves, right? Okay, so I just want you to kind of think about how that chronology is in the background, and maybe we'll we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. Okay? Another thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to define what is meant by, in this chapter, civilization, and what is meant by savagery. Okay? Stated differently, what does a civilized person look like? What does he do? What does a savage look like? What do they do? Okay? And I suppose we'll get to that one when we get to question number 2. All right? So that's kind of what I want to say in preface. And now we're going to go ahead and just get started with number 1, which says, quote from the book, "In thinking about American Indian history, it has become essential to follow the policy of cautious street crossers. Remember to look both ways. Explain what this means and why it is so." So, Maria, is it Maria? Maria, I'm going to start with you. What does it mean that when we think about American Indian history, we should look both ways?
I think that there's like two sides to like how when one culture will be treated than the other.
Okay, 2 sides.
Yeah.
All right. So do you mean to say that we should look at it from both the perspective of so-called European Americans and Native Americans?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Let me see. Monique, Jasmine, Apollonia, right? Yeah, okay. Apollonia, see if you can add to that. Why should we look both ways? Why should we consider both American perspectives on this and Native American perspectives?
Because, different people have different point of views of others.
Yes,
So
of
someone
course.
could say something good and someone could say something bad.
Okay, that's true. That's true. So choose a side in this. Choose either the Native American view or the American view of the problem, and give me an example of how the view of this perspective, whichever one you choose, give me an example of how, well, those perspectives might not be accurate. They're perspectives, but they might not be accurate. Don't know? Okay, Jasmine?
I feel like it's like, okay, let's say one person saying something about a white man, but the other people will just like tag along and follow because they think that that's the right thing, but in reality it's not the right thing.
I think you're right in principle, but I'm actually asking you for a kind of example from the reading. So do you have an example from the reading where either a Native American was inaccurate about a European American or vice versa? We're just trying to illustrate why we need to look both ways. Why the traffic runs in both directions, to stay with the metaphor.
I don't know.
Okay, Monique? Okay, all right. Sue, help us out here.
Can you restate the question?
Yeah, the question is, okay, we understand the principle that you got to look both ways.
Mm-hmm.
We understand the principle that, there are at least 2 perspectives here. But I want some examples of perspectives from either side
Okay.
that were, well, essentially inaccurate.
Well, the white man saw Native Americans as like savages, like hunter and gatherers, and they kind of like perceived them as like a dying race, like a race that is like doomed to become extinct.
And how did that work out? Did they go extinct?
No, they did not.
No. In fact, in the 1980 census, there were how many Native Americans?
I think like 1 million.
1.5 million.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So here's a notion. Here's a notion that European Americans have. By the way, all European Americans?
I'd say the majority.
Okay, maybe the majority. I'll buy that. If you were just to have said something from the Native American perspective, would it be fair to say that all Native Americans thought that, regardless of what you might have said?
I don't think so. Like,
Because?
I feel like people have their own biases.
Okay, people have their own biases, but people have their own experiences as well. Were all Native American experiences the same?
Yeah, for the most part. They were kicked off their lands.
Okay, that's true.
Yeah.
But what if we look at it from the perspective of their culture? Were all their cultures and ways of life and tribal politics and ambitions, were all Native Americans the same?
No.
No, to the contrary. If this chapter argues anything, it argues that this is a complex problem, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And instead, what we do is we tend to flatten it out, right? We make it simple. Because after all, it's easier to remember simple stuff than complicated stuff, right?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, all right. Is it Aricel?
Yes.
Okay, Aricel, help us out some more here. Another kind of, I don't know, mistaken perspective from either side. Reasons why we should look both ways.
The white people felt like the Native Americans weren't like worthy to own land, so they would put them in reservations.
Okay, they weren't worthy to own land. What do you mean by worthy to own
Like
land?
they weren't civilized.
They
They were
weren't
savages, so they shouldn't have land.
Okay, they were savages, so they shouldn't have land, and yet they're putting them onto land. What do you make of that?
Yeah, but they're putting them on land that the superior people put them in, so they're still less.
Okay, all right. So you're touching on another kind of interesting component of this story, and that is, well, for lack of a better term, the force or the violence of, as you say, putting these people onto their land, right? So let me ask you a question, Alex. What about the notion of putting these people onto their land? Is that a fair representation both of what happened from the American side, so to speak, and from the Native American side? And what should we make of this, your answer? So my question is, if we think of the Native Americans being put onto land, how is that actually, according to this article, a misperception? What problems does that create for us if we're trying to understand the actual complex nature of this story?
I'm not really sure, but wouldn't it be something like the whites took their land, but they're putting them back on their own land, but the whites own it now? I don't know.
Well, no, you're right, but
Yeah, they're trying to confine them so they can't grow in population or anything.
okay, well, they weren't concentration camps, but let's be careful here, all right? Let's be respectful to the people who were actually put in concentration camps and the horror of a concentration. I'm just saying, Samantha, we're having fun here. But it's about thinking precisely. You follow me?
They're trying to watch them. Is what I'm trying to say. They're trying to see, make sure they're not doing, trying to take over everything. They're keeping an eye out on them.
Well, okay. Maybe we'll talk more about this. I kind of do, but I also think that this particular reading doesn't actually prove anything about the surveillance of these people. It does talk about putting them onto reservations, but in a sense, it's like putting them onto reservations, but also letting them do what they want on the reservations. You see what I'm saying? Huh?
Have freedom there, though, not let them have
I don't disagree. You're right. But I'm just saying, and this is kind of a technical point, it makes problematic what actually happened in concentration camps if we call something a concentration camp that wasn't a concentration camp. You follow me?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I don't disagree, by the way. If what you're trying to say is that a kind of genocide occurred toward Native Americans. But my point is, it didn't happen through the usage of concentration camps. Whereas if you're looking at Nazi Germany and Hitler and all that, you're talking about a scientific, bureaucratic, industrialized system of concentration camps designed to either extract labor or to kill people. Okay? Which, by the way, it's fair to say that those people in the concentration camps had even much less freedom, if you will, than the Native Americans did. But anyway, Alex, back to my question. It's not that you're incorrect. I mean, you're right what you said. But but I'm trying to get at why it's a problem to use words like, well, they put them on reservations. It's not that that's not accurate, but it also doesn't tell the whole story. So, what do you think?
I'm not sure.
Okay, Melissa?
I'm not sure.
All right, what if I write this word on the board? Does that help? Does that help? Anyone know what agency is? What's agency?
A group of people trying to create a business.
That is true in the business sense. An agency is a business. That's true, but that's not the usage of the word here. By the way, you all have computers and iPhones and shit, and you can find definitions. Use your damn technology if you have to. What is agency?
It's an organization.
No, but you're right, but not in this sense. For individuals to act individually. Brittany, I presume you came to class today. It's Brittany. No, it is. Brittany, I presume you came to class today because you wanted to at some level? It's your choice at some level, right? I presume you're in college because you want to be at some level, which is to say that you have agency. You have control of your life. You shape your life, right? Now, if someone forced you to do all these things, well, maybe you wouldn't have agency, but you do, right? So back to this question. To speak about putting Native Americans on reservations, to speak about, them going along with it. What's the problem with that? Melissa?
They took away their agency.
They took away their agency. And what do you mean by that?
Like, they took away their freedom to, like, live wherever they wanted to.
Well,
Would it be,
no.
Would it be like their communal way of life? Like their individualism? Like their individual way of self?
Well, let me ask it a different way. Is there a way, according to this article, in which we talk about Native Americans, whereby we make them out to be, in the way that we talk about them, less than human? Or is there a way that we can talk about them in which we take away their agency by, for instance, taking away their behavior in the process? Or stated differently, is there a way that we talk about Native Americans by which we turn them not into active historical agents, but rather passive recipients of someone else's force? What do you think? Elizabeth, do you think that is that part of the problem that this article is getting at? That we shouldn't do that, but we do?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So that this article is a corrective, is it not? It's telling us, be careful, because if you're not careful, you're going to talk about Native Americans in a way that takes their humanity away, that takes their agency away, that makes them subhuman, that tells a story which would only be partially true, a story that says, this is what the United States did to them, which is to say, make them passive victims, right? This is what the United States did to them, put them in concentration camps, not. But you know what I'm saying. Theoretically, this is what was done to them. But if that's the only story that we tell, then what we've done is we've created a whole population of victims who had nothing to do with their destiny. Right? You follow me, Sue?
Yeah, I remember, was it like, I think it was History 10. It was like how like it was like about slavery, but there were like different like theories to like how it was like how like slaves had like it was like wrong to like take away like slaves like I don't know how to say it. Like they're I don't remember.
It's
I don't
okay.
know
I know what you. I'll try to finish it off for you. And by the way, I'll remind you of something Una asked. In like the second discussion we had, we were hammering away at slavery and how horrible it was, and a light went on in her head, and she asked, "Well, couldn't this be true with reference to other people besides black people?" And I thought, forgive me, I thought maybe she was thinking about the history of Asian people in this country. And now, notice, we're talking about Native Americans, not slaves. And yet you, Sue, astutely, although you can't flesh it out right now, astutely, you point out that there's a similarity between the way the Native Americans are represented and the way, well, African Americans can be represented, right? And it's all complicated. It's not simple. If we're not careful, we're going to flatten it out. And what we're going to do, in the way that we talk about Native American history, we're going to turn them into people who have no agency. Which is to say, if we're not careful, we'll treat them like they're not even human beings. Human beings who have culture, who have language, who have politics, their own social structure, their own ethos about war and fighting back, right? And I might add, notice this, their own, I didn't write it up there, their own decision to actually assimilate to some degree, right? So let me ask you a question. Did these hundreds of different Native American tribes, which would have existed, by the way, in thousands and thousands of villages, and therefore their social structure, their political structure would have been at the village level, not at the tribal level, okay? Even before they ever had physical contact with a white European, didn't they actually exchange cultural stuff between themselves? And didn't they exchange cultural stuff between themselves and Europeans long before they ever met a European? Because Europeans brought stuff to the continent that then got onto the trading routes and pots and metal and guns and things like that, right? So that the interesting story towards the end of the article is that story of a guy who in the late 1880s was in Wisconsin, went to some tribe, I forget the name of the tribe, watched a so-called authentic war dance of, I don't know, let's just say a Sioux warrior who was wearing jeans and some crow outfit and another headdress from another tribe, right? Illustrating the point that these people are humans and therefore they have their own culture, right? And if we're not careful, if we don't remember to look both ways, we're going to miss the true story. Right? So if we listen to the European perspective, are we getting the truth? Well, we're getting the truth from the European perspective, but we're not getting the truth. And if we just listen to the Native American perspective, we're not getting the truth, except for from that perspective, right? So, for instance, remember the story where the Pueblo Indians or the Apaches did their little skit, and they said, Europeans are stupid, right? They concluded that Europeans were stupid for whatever the reason, and of course that wasn't true either, right? So, what this article then is pleading for us to do is to realize that, so to speak, we need to remember to look both ways. We know very well the story from the European perspective because that's the story we've been told, right? We don't know very well the perspective from the Native American point of view, right? And by the way, remember that when we're talking about Native Americans, we are talking about peoples who are as different from one another as, I don't know, Vietnamese people are from Bolivian people. They spoke different languages, led different lives, they had different economies, right? So the point here is that we need to be careful. We need to understand that when we're talking about Native Americans, we almost can't talk about Native Americans as though they all saw it the same way. And by the way, we can't talk about European Americans as though they all see it the same way. Just like, if we were talking about something else, I can't talk about all Asians seeing it one way, or African Americans seeing it one way, or for that matter, whites seeing it one way. Now, having said that, I want to make it more difficult for you by saying, however, that's how we have to talk. You know what I'm saying? Just yesterday, I was making a statement on a different topic in class, and I said, I don't know what it's like to act white, although I kind of do. And I don't know what it means to act black, but I kind of do, right? But we sometimes know the difference between how a white guy acts and how a black guy acts, right? So, just to kind of have some fun, watch Justin Timberlake at the Super Bowl, right? He's from Memphis. He's a white boy, grew up on country music. Now he's a hip-hop artist or a pop artist, right? And he comes out, and you could argue, and I'm not arguing that there's anything wrong with it, but you could argue that in a way, he carries himself like a black guy. Sometimes. Right? Whatever that means. But you see him on Jimmy Fallon, and he's just white old Justin Timberlake doing impressions of different kinds of dances and music. And you know what I'm saying? So what I am saying, this is all I want to say, is that this piece calls on us to realize that actually there are more than two ways of seeing this problem. There are many, many ways. But if we're not careful, what we're going to do is we're going to rhetorically portray a picture that can't be true. Right? And so, when we talk about the persistence of natives, might this author be saying that because the natives had agency, because they couldn't be, fully destroyed, put in their place, because in certain ways they either refused to be put in their place or they assimilated, right? Which caused problems, especially when federal policy changes, right? So the point here is that we need to make sure that we're treating these people fairly, right? Okay, that's enough on that. All right, in what way has mainstream history characterized Native Americans? What images seem to predominate? So, Christian, I'm going to start with you, and in particular, I want to think here about this distinction between civilization and savagery. Okay. So that we might understand better what are meant by these concepts, I actually want to ask the question, Christian, talking about Native Americans, if they were savage or seen as savage, what other words were used to describe that savagery? And if they were seen as civilized, which they probably weren't, or if we're talking about civilizing them, what words might fit over here? And I think it's possible, actually, to find contrasting words. And if you didn't pick this up on page 190, You could flip to page 190 and maybe you'll find it there, okay? So Christian, help us out. We would refer to Native Americans as savage because why? They are what? They do what? What words are we talking about here? Say it again.
I said I got seen as a dying race when they were expired. Their destiny would be become.
Okay. All right. So they're seen as a dying race.
Yeah.
Why?
Because the way they're seen as by the whites, like less advantage.
But why are they going to die? I think you're onto something. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just trying to flesh it out. You say they're a dying race. Why? Okay, because they're not civilized. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put your word over here. All right? They're dying because they're not civilized, or they're dying because they can't overcome the civilizing tendencies, whatever those are, of the Europeans. Right? Okay, I heard somebody over here.
In the book it says like they are using their full potential.
Okay, they're not using their full potential, right?
Yeah, they're relying on hunting and gathering.
Okay, so savage also means hunting and gathering, right?
All civilization is like more like they're not using their land like.
Okay, so civilization then would be, we might call developed agriculture, right? Okay, so that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for contrasts here. We have hunting and gathering, that's savage. We have developed ag, that is civilized. Help me out here. Yes, Brittany. Spoken language, meaning not written, right? Over here, under civilized, if they were civilized, they'd have what kind of language? It's not that they wouldn't speak it, but they would also write it, right? Or, to use a different word that you guys are in love with, literacy, right? Academic literacy, right? So, literate, written languages equal civilized, spoken, unwritten languages equal savage. What else? Yes, Sue? All right, so superstition over here. Another word we might use is pagan, right? But over here, if you're civilized, you're Christian. And by the way, we mean Christian. We don't mean Muslim. We mean Christian. And likely we mean Protestant Christian, not necessarily Catholic Christian. All right? But that's maybe a little something else. All right, what else? What's that?
They're greedy with their land.
That these people are greedy. Is that what you're saying? Okay. Boy, there's a projection for you, right? You know what I mean by projection? So it's when I project onto you something that I'm thinking and I say, oh, that's what he's thinking or that's what he's feeling, when in fact I feel it, right? Okay. All right. What else? All right. So, emotions. And you say no reasoning, but we will say at least that civilization is characterized by reason. Savagery is characterized by heart or emotion, right? So I'm a savage. What else? Anything else? What about property? Nobility. Okay. So we're going to say nobility. And here we're going to say violence. Some more projection, Brittany? Is that some more projection? The notion of European Americans thinking that they themselves aren't violent, but they are instead noble? I mean, think about it for a minute. These are European Americans who are defining the other And in defining the other, the way they define the other keeps them from seeing that they are in fact violent. See what I'm saying? Okay. What else? What about property ownership? It's very important. With reference to property, savage would be?
Common ownership.
Okay, common ownership. Okay. What if you're civilized? You go for that common ownership stuff?
No, just
Individual or private? Private property. Okay. Let me see. We missed anything? Okay, what about childhood? Where does childhood fit in here? Why would we call Native Americans childlike?
Caring association of both nobility and violence, savagery, both mankind's childhood.
Savagery. So you're saying savagery is characterized by childhood? If, although it's not said in there, Carlos, if savagery is characterized by childhood, what might we say civilization is characterized by? Adulthood or maturity, right? So that Native Americans then, because they're savage, are childlike. As a people, as a culture, they haven't reached their full potential. Full potential would be characterized by, maturity, wherein they are reasonable people using written, literate languages, right? Engaging in developed agriculture, behaving like, I don't want to say nobles, but behaving in a mature fashion, and of course, engaging in the practice of acquiring private property, and that private property then being your ticket, as it were, to full civilized humanity. So let me ask you a question. When the Europeans talk this way, who are they talking about when they talk about the civilized people? Talking about themselves, right? Notice this. They're saying our way of life is the civilized way of life. Their way of life is the savage way of life. Right? Now, another interesting thing about this piece. Okay, so let me just make sure. In what way has mainstream history characterized Native Americans? What images seem to predominate? I think these images do seem to predominate. But I also want to be clear that mainstream history also makes the mistake that we talked about earlier of flattening out these people's lives. In other words, they don't appear as three-dimensional, real human beings. They're kind of like those paintings that George Catlin made. Right? Right? By the way, did George Catlin, was he sympathetic to Native Americans?
Yeah.
Very, right? Why was he sympathetic, by the way? You know, why was he sympathetic, George Catlin, that painter in the early part of the chapter? I mean, he actually liked Native Americans.
I felt that, or I think that, or what I perceived is that he felt bad for them, and he felt that they shouldn't have been treated for the way that they've been treated. So he kind of felt remorse for them in a way.
Okay, he did feel remorse for them, that's true. And by the way, as I go over to our other Rosa, no, you're not the other Rosa, you're Rosa, right? Right? Yeah. I don't want to make you the other Rosa from that Rosa. You guys are completely equal. Okay. Anyway. I don't want to otherize you. So anyway, what were you going to say?
Didn't he have an experience with the natives? Didn't he go and experience them?
Yeah, he did.
I think they said something to him that kind of caught with him and made him like see them differently.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. Okay. Mr. Olmos? Carlos?
Oh, yes.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say anything.
Oh, who had their hand up over there? Oh, you were just stretching.
Yeah. Oh, but she wanted to add a
I was
compliment.
gonna say like he thought that it was a lost cause and he thought they were like fragile.
Fragile, lost cause.
Yeah.
Lost cause that they wouldn't be able to make the adjustments they needed to the European American way of life, and it would ultimately kill them. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. So let me see. What am I trying to get at here? Damn. What was the question I asked?
How they saw themselves as civilized, and then the Indians were savagery.
Right. You know what?
That was about Kate. What's her name? Kate.
Oh, Catelyn or Caitlin, right. My question was, how did he feel about them? And he was sympathetic towards them, right? But he was also critical, personally, of European Americans. Gerline, do you remember? What was he critical? He was critical about European Americans, Catelyn was. Do you remember what he was? He said, these Indians are going to die off because these European Americans behave a certain way. Do you remember his characterization?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Let me see. Nancy?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Karina? You're not sure? Isla? No? Is anybody? Rosa?
Is it where like he says that noble savages cannot coexist with civilization, and how like their decline was fated?
Well, he does, but I'm actually asking you for how he criticizes his own, for lack of a better term, his own culture, European Americans. Right, they were selfish, they just wanted the land, right? So, a big picture that emerges here is that, well, civilization, if you will, all of those things in that list, some people like Catelyn saw as, well, not so good. And yet, he didn't actually break with that tradition, did he? And when the American Fur Trade Company offered him, a chance to go down the Mississippi on the steamboat with buffalo skins, he went with them and he didn't complain. He didn't say, hey, you guys are rapacious and you're killing off the Native Americans. He just said, well, this is the way it is.
Didn't he use that to help the natives? Didn't he kind of like do that to help them or something? I'm not sure.
Well, he's a very ambivalent character because on the one hand, he is sympathetic towards the plight of the Native Americans and they're dying off and they're not going to survive, which he was wrong about, right, Sue? Okay, so that's one way that he sees them. As dying off, which, by the way, might imply that they're not capable. Think about this. That they're not capable of surviving in the face of civilization. That idea would even make them more savage, right? You follow me? Okay. And yet he's ambivalent because on the one hand, he sees that European acquisitiveness and the desire for land and property, which is to say greed, right? That these Native Americans can't stand in the face of that they will die off. And yet, he also realizes, notice this, that that's just an inevitable part of the process. That is civilization being civilization, and that's the way it is. Now, I'm not asking you guys to make judgments about that, as much as I'm encouraging you guys to think about how possibly oppressive that can be. In other words, if the only way that Native Americans can survive is to become European American or become civilized, that's a very, very powerful, violent kind of notion. Conquest, that's the name of this book. The Legacy of Conquest, right? And what I want you guys to think about is American culture. Where America comes from. Where our ideas and our thoughts come from. So if, for instance, you can enslave blacks, If, for instance, you can take away Native American land and decimate their culture, although they're going to fight back, just as blacks did, by the way, right, Sue? This is where slavery and Native American policy kind of go hand in hand. Blacks created their own culture. We talked about that. They inhabited that necessary space between themselves and their masters or their former masters, right? In other words, because they're human beings, they had culture. Same thing with Native Americans. Yes, their culture is different than so-called civilized European American culture, but it's still culture. They're still human. But how does America behave towards them? In similar ways we behave towards the African Americans. And so what I want you guys to think about are the ways in which these attitudes are deeply embedded, listen to this, in American culture. We seem to keep doing this stuff over and over and over again. It is a part of our, national biography. It seems to be a part of our genetic makeup. And by genetic, I don't mean genetic, I mean historical genetic makeup, right? It's encoded in us, right? And I'm very aware of this because, I'm one of the few, apparently, Europeans in the room, if you know what I mean, right? Yeah, Sue.
Can I call you Dr. Woke?
Dr. what? Woke? I don't know. I've seen Get Out, if that's what you mean. I guess. You can call me whatever you want. How's that? All right, so listen, let me just finish by saying, as usual, I don't care if we get everything. I want you to get something. And what I want you to get from today's reading and discussion is that American civilization is both consistent and very problematic. Okay? If we're going to make America great again, which is fine with me, we need to find the greatness and go back to the greatness. The problem is there's so much in our history that's not great, and we need to make sure that if we're going to make America great again, we don't go back to that stuff. You follow me?
So which part was great?
All right. So hasta la vista. We'll see you guys. By the way, let me